And Trish, Trisha, let me ask you, we started to do this choreography out in plain sight, but did you want to manage the agenda? Have you and Senator Hickman had that conversation, or do you want me to do it?
Sure. Sure, I can jump in. I did connect with Senator Hickman before this meeting. I know he has he was not he was a little under the weather. I think he had a migraine. But I think he's planning to join, but we did agree that it would make sense for me to just kind of jump in and get things started, and he'll join when he's able to, I think.
Thank
So
you.
I'm happy to do that. Are we waiting for anyone else, or should I just go ahead?
I think you should go ahead.
Okay.
That's
Yeah,
they'll find us.
okay, sounds good. Yeah, we do have a pretty full agenda, and we'll be getting a good information download today to help kind of inform our work moving forward. So I'll just quickly walk us through the plan for today's meeting. Claire Hawkins is here from DACF, and she'll walk us through some of the takeaways from the listening sessions held for the state's agricultural infrastructure investment program and resilient food system infrastructure program. Erica Campbell from In Common Group will then provide us with an analysis of the existing funding landscape and that research that she's been compiling. We'll then have an opportunity for, can you drop the agenda in the chat, Jody? Okay. There'll be an opportunity for public input, and then towards the end of the meeting, we plan to revisit the conversation about meeting format and that we started at the last meeting and make some decisions on a plan for a couple of in-person meetings. Is there anything I'm missing or anything else that folks were hoping or expecting to cover today that isn't on the list? All right, well, maybe we can just kind of jump in then with Claire's part of the presentation and go from there.
Great, thanks, Trisha. Can everyone hear me okay? Yeah, great. Nice to see some familiar faces that I haven't seen since like last summer. So good to see everyone. For folks that I haven't met yet, I'm Claire Hawkins. I'm the Director of Economic Development for DACF. And I think the goal today is to give you just an introduction to some information that's available to you as this board does the good work of building the fund. We don't have a ton of time on the agenda today, so I'm going to show you some slides. You can have them after the fact. They're intended to be a reference for you, but this is really the first sort of introductory welcome to AIIP. And then I'm also, if we have time, just going to draw some threads together regarding the Resilient Food Systems Infrastructure Program that USDA funded recently. So with that, if I may, I'd like to share my screen and show you some slides. I tried to get through this as quickly as possible, and it took me about 24 minutes with only a moderate elevation of heart rate. So we'll try for that again. And the intention is to leave lots of time for questions. So with host disabled participant screen sharing. Hosts, may I share my screen?
Tom will be working on that.
Thanks, Tom.
Should be allowed now.
Okay, let me give it a go. Great. Here we are. Can everyone see these slides, and are they an okay scale?
Perfect.
Great. All right. So a couple of quick things before we get started. I think the real driver behind sharing some of this information with you all today is the completion of an analysis that we recently conducted with the help of a very fine contractor. We basically analyzed the entirety of the AIIP applicant pool, which, as you'll learn very shortly, if you don't already know, was very large. And the goal of trying to evaluate the applicant pool for a program like this is so we can continue to improve our understanding of the investment potential for infrastructure. Couple of caveats here. You are actually seeing the very first synthesis of this report. So this presentation is based on a report that's about 60 pages of statistics. Hopefully what you see here is a lot easier to digest than that. It is notably only agriculture and food business. And I would even further caveat that to say terrestrial agriculture. It's not inclusive of aquaculture, it's not inclusive of seafood, and it's not inclusive of forestry. But I think some of the findings here will be relevant for those adjacent natural resource sectors. And if we have time, I can also talk a little bit about some of the earlier research that was done for forestry and marine sector needs as well. Okay. A lot of folks on this call are aware of the genesis of AIIP. So this program came from an allocation through the Maine Jobs and Recovery Program in 2022. We partnered with CEI as our third-party administrator to get these grants dispersed. CEI had previously partnered with DACF for some CARES funded programs that also sought to provide some public investment money in infrastructure during the pandemic, and that experience went so well that we asked them to come back and work with us again to get the AIIP money into the community. This was about $20 million allocated through the MJRP, and the goal was to allow for investments in agricultural processing infrastructure that would help mitigate some of the disruptions and challenges that we were hearing about as a result of the pandemic, while also enhancing supply chain resilience, increasing our local capacity for processing that would therefore enable production. So really a pretty comprehensive approach to trying to boost our ability through infrastructure investment. So while AIIP was technically emergency funding because it was funded through the MJRP using ARPA, our American Rescue Plan Act funds, it wasn't a reactionary approach to grant making. It was deeply rooted in stakeholder engagement. And actually, before the MJRP even came out, we had done quite a lot of market research, some in-depth stakeholder interviews, a number of surveys, and also a formal economic impact analysis with our colleagues at the University of Maine School of Economics, all with the intent of trying to characterize and kind of ground truth our understanding of what was really needed in terms of agricultural infrastructure in the state. So we did a lot of outreach while we were designing and building this program. We worked with other agencies. We worked with technical assistance providers like SCORE to try and understand how to make this program as effective and efficient as we could. Interestingly enough, when you look back at the stakeholder feedback from 2021 or 2022, many of the same articulated needs and challenges remain relevant today. Though it's important to note that this program, the data collected through the analysis, it's from 2021 and 2022. So it's a bit dated now. And some of these specific types of investment needs reflected in the landscape may be a bit different today. And I'll circle back on that. Okay, the next few slides serve to give you an idea of the impact of the awards we were able to make through AIIP. So I think a lot of folks have heard that this program was highly saturated in terms of applications. Demand far outpaced our available funds. Again, we had $20 million roughly to deploy as grants. We received over 800 applications, and the cumulative request amount was something around $180 million. We were able to make 64 awards across the state. A total of $19.3 million was administered as grants, which means that at least the remaining investment opportunity circa 2022 for agricultural infrastructure was probably more than $160 million. That's remaining opportunity, and that's 2022 dollars. So it's very likely that the investment opportunity just in this space is quite a bit higher than that based on cost increases today. How's AIIP doing? How are these projects doing? We have some preliminary impact data. Typically, impact data is realized several years post-award, but we're already starting to see some pretty transformational impacts from this funding. By the end of 2024, about 42% of our funded projects were complete. According to self-reporting from our ongoing monitoring process, we understand that awardees have created approximately 85 new jobs. These are inclusive of full-time, part-time, and seasonal jobs. And the indirect benefits of this funding are also pretty extensive. Awardees estimate that approximately 247 farms and 60 processors have benefited indirectly from these projects. And some examples of those indirect benefits are supply chain relationships and shared infrastructure. I think in general, this program, while it couldn't do as much as we wanted because of the availability of funds, the awards that were made are by and large doing some really good work in the agricultural community. Awardees have reported upon completion of their projects that they experienced or they achieved increased capacity to meet that sustained demand, which was one of the sort of priorities of this program. A lot of awardees noted they were able to access additional financial resources. So that's lower interest rates, private capital, expanded credit, and even commercial loans. They were able to diversify their product lines and increase production efficiencies by purchasing equipment and upgrading facilities and through facility modernization. And they also were reportedly able to lower some energy costs through utilities improvements. These are just some examples of the early impact that we are seeing via our reporting. Okay, so why did we do the applicant pool analysis? The goal here was basically to take this enormous database of information we had about what were purportedly shovel-ready projects in the infrastructure realm and to get a more thorough qualitative and quantitative analysis of the remaining investment potential in this space. And so the analysis, it helps us understand the nuances surrounding investment need across different agricultural sectors. And it also helps us understand the needs as they are differentiated by business type. We'll talk a lot more about that in the next few slides. And just a note, I'm actually not watching the chat because I'm trying to get through this very quickly, but if there are important questions, will someone stop me?
Yeah, I'm keeping an eye on it.
Thank you very much. Okay, any good study notes its limitations. In public investment, there are usually many, but I think the most important here are, is just to note to this group that while this information about AIIP is quite robust, it's one lens through which we can try and understand the investment need for infrastructure in Maine's natural resource sectors. And with any funding solicitation, the funding objectives are inherently going to influence the characterization of need. And what I mean by that is proposals tend to mirror the priorities listed in the request for applications, right? So some alignment is expected, but I think it doesn't dilute sort of the narrative and the insights that we're able to glean from this work. And then, I think the most important takeaway for this group with regard to ongoing work is the importance of continuing direct stakeholder engagement to make sure that our assumptions about needs are rooted in reality and in the current time. Okay, in this section, I'm going to give you a little bit of an understanding of what the AIIP applicant pool looked like, who submitted applications, from where and for what. And then after that, we'll talk a little bit about the market access implications of those projects. So we had a total of 813 eligible proposals from all counties in Maine. You can see a heat map on the right of the screen that shows where most applications came from. Aroostook County submitted the most, followed by Cumberland County, Kennebec, and Waldo. And on the other end of the spectrum, we see Sagadahoc, Franklin, and Piscataquis with some lower turnout numbers. Some of this is precipitated by the concentration of farms, right, of agricultural businesses in the state. So it's likely not all that surprising to see a preponderance of applications from Aroostook County, but this matters when we think about equitable geographic distribution within the state. So that's something we'll circle back to. Okay, here's some notes on methodology. I'll keep this high level. And, I know this is a lot of text. Feel free to let it wash over you and just listen for a moment. We asked all AIIP applicants to self-identify as one of three business categories: as a farm processor, or a processor. A farm processor is simply a farm that does some degree of processing on site. This can get a little confusing because the outward-facing grant program offered two tracks. One is for farms and one is for processors. The reason we assigned this third designation of a farm processor was really for the purposes of evaluation, because it helped us filter to a higher level of granularity around the business category. That third designation of a farm processor, similarly helpful for this analysis. So that's why you see that language or that term reflected here. Every applicant was also asked to select the sector in which the majority of their business activities occurred. So we'll see grain, dairy, fruit, meat, poultry, vegetable, and in some cases, other. Okay, Here's where we can start to get a more visual understanding of what was reflected in the applicant pool. If you look at the proportion of applications by sector, so the percentage by sector, we see the highest percentage of applications coming from vegetable operations, followed by meat and poultry, and then decreasing through fruit, dairy, grain, and that other category. Similarly, the total request amount by sector follows the same path. So we see the most request amount, so the most amount of money requested by vegetable operations, and then meat and poultry, fruit, dairy, grain, and other. Another way to think about this is by business category. So the majority of funding requests we received of that 180-ish million came from farms and farm processors, both of which are farms in this case. The vast majority of responses, or rather of requests. Processors actually made up a smaller proportion of the total request amount. But what's interesting here is that processor proposals, while there were fewer, were often more expensive, right? They have bigger budgets. They're often standalone operations. Their individual line items are more expensive. So we see fewer, higher value requests from those proposals, whereas we just got a ton of farm requests that were sort of diverse across the level of funding they needed. But often farm proposals had smaller budgets, there were just more of them. And this makes sense based on the sort of business landscape, right? We have more farms than processors, or we did at this time. Okay, so what does this mean in terms of understanding the investment opportunity? Based on this information we have about the frequency and size of requests, we can make a few initial we can come away with a few initial insights. And that is specifically that the investment opportunity seems to be most significant in specific combinations of sectors and business categories. And so one of the most significant opportunities lies in the vegetable sector, so across business types. There's also significant investment opportunity for infrastructure with meat and poultry. And then you can see the remaining opportunity broken down by business type with fruit, grain, and dairy. And so this is sort of a first pass at helping us understand where the majority or the priority need remains within this space. But again, it's likely something that needs to be tested against current stakeholder feedback. Okay, I'd like to tell you a little bit about how proposals said they would use funds. Again, I'm going to go through this pretty quickly, but it's available to you indeterminately. So we asked applicants to please categorize their proposed uses of funding and also their anticipated benefits to the business. The most common use of funds proposed was capital improvements to expand capacity. It was also very common among over half of applicants to request funds for equipment, specifically growing, processing, manufacturing, and storage equipment, and in addition to that, construction and utilities upgrades. And by and large, the most commonly cited benefits to the business were operational efficiencies and increased profitability as a result of those investments. Here's another way of saying the same thing. This is inverted. So the most commonly cited use of grant funds is at the bottom, capital improvements. As we go up, we start to see growing, processing, manufacturing, and storage equipment. We see upgrades to utilities being very popular, and then decreasing down through packaging and handling equipment, warehouse equipment, etc. Interestingly enough, many of these same stated infrastructure or asset-based priorities are reflected in the listening session feedback from RFSI. So I think capital improvements, facility modernization, storage, cold storage, regular storage, and processing equipment. These all, I think, remain areas of articulated interest among prospective applicants for this type of funding. Some other anticipated benefits of this funding based on the proposals, 78% of applicants reported that their project would create new full-time, part-time, or seasonal jobs. These are direct hires, so this is not calculating for multiplier effects, which could be very interesting in the future. Most commonly, applicants anticipated creating 3 or fewer jobs in 1 or more employment types, so 3 or fewer jobs in either full-time, part-time, or seasonal hires. 99% of farm processors and 69% of farms said that their projects would increase their ability to process Maine-grown foods. And these proposals also largely indicated that they would be able to increase sourcing of Maine-grown and produced inputs. So this is a connection to infrastructure and local procurement and consumption goals, which we'll circle back to. So shared infrastructure is something that came up pretty regularly in applications for this program. And there's some nuance to this, which I'll call out in the end as well. But many applicants emphasize the importance of having access to shared infrastructure, particularly as a means of overcoming individual business limitations, whether that's limited financial resources, limited access to equipment, or something a little bit different. So roughly half of applicants reported that their operations could support other agricultural businesses by sharing infrastructure. Among those, vegetable operations were the most likely to say that they would like to share infrastructure, followed by meat and poultry. And you can see some examples in the bottom bullet here of what those shared infrastructure assets might look like: cold storage, freezer space, etc. One insight to keep in mind is that different types of businesses benefit from sector-specific investments. And what I mean by that is, depending on where you focus the grant funding in terms of product category or the sector itself, it may benefit a certain profile of business more than others. And so the insights from this analysis indicate that more farms benefit from investments in meat and poultry infrastructure, and also vegetable and grain. More processors, so standalone processors, tend to benefit from investment in meat and poultry and grain processing. More value-added producers tend to benefit from investment in meat and poultry processing, followed by grain. And more supply chain businesses, so up and downstream, benefit from investments in vegetable and meat and poultry processors, followed by grain. I think this could be interpreted in a number of ways, but one important thing to note here is that while based on self-reporting through the applicant pool data, we might begin to test the idea that investing in certain types of infrastructure in certain sectors might have the broadest benefit to different types of businesses. It's also really important to ensure that we are investing in businesses that don't necessarily claim to support many upstream or downstream entities other than themselves, but because we need to establish a strong producer base in order to get to the production levels necessary to support the whole system. A bit of a disclaimer there. Okay, a few sector-specific themes and needs. I'm going to move through these again pretty quickly. Across the board, applicants reported that demand for their products far outpaces supply. They report that cold storage improvements are critical. They indicate that improvements that enable year-round production are critical to meet demand. And they also indicated that shared facilities like commercial kitchens can further support diversification, value-added production, and food safety certifications. There's an asterisk by commercial kitchens because while it was cited in the 2022-ish data that we're looking at today, when we looked at the solicitations, or rather the proposals for RFSI more recently, there were very few applications for commercial kitchens. And so I think that's an area where we need to probe a little bit to understand current needs. I won't go through the sector-specific priorities in too much depth, but know that for each of the sectors, vegetable, meat and poultry, dairy, et cetera, we're able to understand in a little bit more granularity what specific types of infrastructure they need. So for example, while vegetable operations might be really prioritizing cold storage and wash pack upgrades, something in the meat and poultry sector might actually be prioritizing housing and breeding infrastructure, feed storage, or refrigeration. We can pull the same types of insights for fruit operations, grain, and dairy. And again, this just helps us understand some of the nuance across sector and business type when it comes to agricultural processing needs. Okay, a few market access implications, and then I'll wrap it up. By and large, what we are hearing in these proposals is that market access opportunities are unlocked or enabled by infrastructure investment. And so when you allow for the physical asset base to increase production and processing capacity, it puts businesses in a better position to access new and existing markets. And it also helps them expand. And whether that expansion comes through increased direct-to-consumer efforts or strengthening relationships with national or international brands, we heard a lot of narrative content about the importance of market access as it hinges on infrastructure access. And another note here that I think is worth calling out is that our local food procurement and consumption goals as reflected in Maine's climate action goals can be definitely supported by thoughtful investment in infrastructure that supports local processing capacity for a variety of different types of markets. These are a few more statistics. I won't go through them in too much detail, but basically what this is saying is many applicants across business type, farms, farm processors, and processors all noted that these projects would help them access new markets, and they characterize, depending on the type of business, the priorities around market access that type of grant funding would enable. So whether it's a farm that is looking to improve product quality or get a food safety certification, or a processor who's looking to diversify into a specialty food line like gluten-free or allergen-free, having the physical assets, the infrastructure allows them a greater likelihood of access to that new market. Okay, this is the end. We're almost there. Considerations for future investment programs. This is where we're hoping to share some insights that could help the fund. I think the first consideration is not a surprise. It is be mindful of sector and business category specific investment opportunities. So in addition to understanding the nuance across different sectors, and in this case, different natural resource economies, right? Because it's not just agriculture, it's also going to be forestry, et cetera. That can help enable a greater level of specificity in the grant making approach or the funding and investing approach, and it can also increase impact. The second consideration is to make sure to connect or consider connecting infrastructure investments with that market access opportunity. We know that these sort of strategic streams are complementary, and investing in the infrastructure can often better position businesses for market entry and expansion. Promised I would circle back on shared infrastructure. This continues to be a pretty broadly articulated opportunity, but there is some nuance. The first nuance I'll point out is just that funding opportunities should consider whether or not their priority is establishing shared infrastructure, so paying for the actual physical asset, equipment, processing line, whatever it is, or by investing in coordinating access to shared infrastructure. And what I mean by that, and the quotation word here, activation, is it's one thing to pay for the infrastructure that will allegedly be shared. It's another to ensure that that participatory process is happening and that all possible beneficiaries are accessing the shared equipment. And another note here before I wrap up the shared infrastructure piece is that there's some tension reflected in the applicant pool around shared infrastructure. And the tension, I think, is natural, and it is between the business owner's desire to be independent, right, and resilient to externalities. So being able to, that's a narrative like, I want to have my own equipment so that I don't have to rely on anyone else, and I'm not susceptible to interruptions. And then the other side of the narrative is, I really want to share infrastructure. I want to help other farms, and I want to have access to shared infrastructure. So there's a bit of a balance, I think, that has to be further tested to understand how that would work well from an investment strategy perspective. Okay, final consideration, just a note on maximizing geographic distribution. I think based on the AIIP experience, we see that some counties log higher proposal rates than others. And if geographic distribution across the state is a programmatic goal, there are some ways we can work through that, whether it's making sure there's targeted outreach across counties, whether it's lending some weighted scoring to maybe underrepresented counties or something like that, that's an option. And in general, it might be helpful to collect stakeholder feedback from different areas in Maine to understand if there are different regional needs from an infrastructure perspective. Now, that was fast. I hope it was fast enough for the agenda. I think the intent was to leave some time for questions, and then also know that I'm happy to chat a little bit about RFSI as it connects to this. And also, there are some slides included as an appendix in this document that give the highlights from one of the surveys we did before we built AIIP that helps you understand how we collected insights to determine the contours of the program.
There's one question in the chat about whether the larger report is available to review in addition to these slides.
Yeah, that's a great question. So This is the very first synthesis of that report we've done. So we barely had an internal debrief about this before this group has seen it. So it's very new. I can certainly see about sharing the full report. And I think the intent of having that report was that so people have a reference where they're interested in, you know, processors in the grain space in, you know, X location, they can go to that section and pull that data. So let me follow up, but I think the goal is ultimately to be able to share it.
Great, thanks.
Can I just make two other related points? One is that the intention is not only to share these slides afterwards, but because it's a lot of information, to have it serve as a resource once we get to the point where we have working groups, where we can really dig into this further. So the point isn't to sort of capture it all today and figure it out, but rather to have that as a resource moving forward. The other key thing that maybe we buried the lead here is to say that we really do recognize that forestry is not captured in any of this conversation yet, and we need to make time to have a comparable presentation about forestry investment opportunities and needs. And we will be trying to work with DECD to pull that together, if not at the next meeting, then at the meeting after that. But it's our intention to do something comparable on the forestry side.
Question?
Please.
Yeah, this is Matt Chin. Thank you for that report. Very, very interesting. I'm wondering if you think there might be an underrepresented infrastructure need from those who have a fear of or no experience in applying for grants.
Oh, I'd say undoubtedly. I think that's a real important thing for any future fund to consider is accessibility in terms of just experience around grant writing. And I think if there's one thing we've learned from AIIP, it's that infrastructure can be helpful at very, very small early stage business scale, all the way up through established processors. So I think it's ubiquitous.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
One more minute. Does anyone else have questions for Claire? I can't see any hands.
Amy, maybe? Hi.
Hi. Yeah, thanks. Thanks so much for the presentation, Claire. I was curious, one of the slides talked about the ability to expanding the ability to process. And so did you have like so far, like processing capacity has been increased by X% or anything like that?
You mean from the awards that were made for this program?
Yeah, or even a projection for once the rest of them are completed.
That's a great question. So I think the kind of discrete quantitative economic impact of processing capacity hasn't been calculated yet. When we built the program, we worked with the University of Maine to run an economic impact analysis on a number of different sectors just to test whether or not they could accommodate these levels of increases in processing. So it would be interesting to see a pre and post program analysis for sure, but it might be a little bit down the road.
Okay, can I have, I know Sarah has her hand up. Can I do a quick follow-up or can you come back to me after Sarah, please? Okay, thanks, Sarah. Yeah, I was, when you talked about upgraded to utilities, did that include like solar interconnection or just, and then, sorry, this is not very polite of me, but I'm gonna cram in another one. I was going back to the statute for like definition of like supply chain and value added and processing, but it seems like there might be some overlap because one of the slides was talking about like value added producers and processors and sort of like the prioritized impacts and needs and stuff like that. So and then supply chain businesses. And so there is some overlap. I'd have to see the slide again to like get back to that question, but
yeah. So I think two quick answers are for the latter question about impacts or needs specifically for different supply chain versus value added. That I think could be informed by the definitions for those terms in the program guidelines for AIIP. So this program conceptualized those business types specifically. So that could be helpful. And then Amy, remind me of your first question. I'm sorry.
So upgrade to
Oh.
utilities, how is that defined and does it include solar?
Yes, again, program guidelines, great reference for that.
Okay,
Did include solar, and some applicants did end up purchasing solar panels and other for renewable energy.
okay, thanks so much.
Yeah, of course.
Hi, Claire. I was just curious about process. So before the AIP fund kind of happened, I'm assuming there was obviously like a rubric for eligibility, scoring, measuring success, taking surveys, getting insights like you just shared with us. Is that something that's like available for us to look at? Because I think that's part of our job too, if I'm not mistaken.
It is available, it is organized, and it has been well vetted through a thorough appeals process. So yes, we can share a lot of information about the evaluation structure, the process, all of it. It's a lot of information. So in general, please know that, I'm certainly available personally, and then I'm sure others are available as well to share materials and walk you through them when it's useful.
Thank you.
Sure.
Great. Thanks so much, Claire. I think maybe I'm sure we're going to have so many more questions for you as we start to dig into this information. So maybe we can start to channel additional questions your way. And I think for now, is Erica Campbell here?
We're going to have her colleague, Aisha,
Okay.
provide the presentation, and then I think that she'll be joining us. Erica will be joining us shortly thereafter.
Okay, great.
Wonderful. Thank you all. I am just going to get the presentation up and make sure I have access to share. And just to confirm that everyone can see the screen.
Yes.
Wonderful. All right. Thank you, Jody and Trisha. As Jody shared, my partner, Erica Campbell from In Common Group, is actually the one who led this phase of the research that we've been doing for developing the evaluation metrics and recommendations for the fund. So she will be joining as soon as she can. She is actually finishing speaking at a conference right now, but we'll be on to answer any questions that come up. So feel free to drop those in the chat as I'm running through this, and we will make sure to address them at the end. And then just a moment to introduce myself, because I haven't been on any calls with you. I'm Aisha Ali. I am partner and co-founder of In Common Group, helping lead this project. My area of focus has really been on the stakeholder assessment phase, which I'll walk through in a moment. And then we are also joined in this project by Eric DeLuca of Leverage Point Consulting, who has overseen the benchmarking study that I think will be shared with the advisory board in the coming weeks if it hasn't been already. And just to reiterate, our goal with this project is to develop the recommendations to support the Maine Agriculture, Food, and Forest Products Infrastructure Fund for the advisory board to really be able to have a moment of just understanding of what the gaps and barriers are and how this fund can best be utilized through our synthesis of the existing relevant data, gathering of input from businesses and business owners across key agricultural, food, and forest product sectors, as well as additional relevant community and agency stakeholders. So this is our 5-phase project process. You can see that the existing resources and benchmark studies already have some of those tasks grayed out. The existing resources report, which has been shared and which I'll be reviewing for Erica right now, has been completed, and really just want to highlight that that should be understood as being a scan. There had been some previous research done prior to this in 2021, 2022 that we built on, but this is not an exhaustive landscape analysis. This is really to identify initial key gaps and barriers and just start to create that catalog of available resources in terms of funds and technical assistance. The benchmark study has also been brought to a good point. It is available for review with, I believe, the internal team. We're starting to really understand what the successes, challenges, and gaps have been from other states that have done this similar type of work, Massachusetts, Michigan, and Vermont being those 3 that were benchmarked, and then starting to really understand how to apply what we are learning from those processes to inform this fund. The engagement phase is where we're at right now. We've just completed the review of interim stakeholder assessment findings and developed a report, pairing that with what our findings were from the existing resources report to align those gaps and barriers that we want to dig into deeper. And from this, we've already developed Thank you, sorry. We've developed a survey that will be going out to TA and capital finance providers, as well as a separate survey for farms and businesses, just to really offer a breadth of opportunity for feedback. We will also be conducting new interviews, but we want to focus those on really sector-specific experts and targeted selections for interviewees based on what those gaps and barriers have come up that we want to be able to dig deeper into and have some specific nuance developed from there. And then we will also be having a focus group with the advisory board in June that my colleague Erica will be facilitating in person. And then all of that will lead up into the final evaluation metrics framework to assess the program impacts and, of course, the final report with recommendations. This is just a quick overview of the project timeline. The blue diamond there indicates where we are at right now, which, as I said, is starting to conduct the stakeholder assessment analysis and moving into interviews and surveys. This is also the point where the advisory board starts to have a much larger role in the review process. As I said, the existing resources report has been provided. The benchmarking report will be made available and we'll be presenting on that at the next meeting, so on and so forth. But you'll be able to see a lot more from what we've been working on moving forward. And this is just a quick overview of that existing resources report, the table of contents, so you have the understanding of what was really examined here. It starts with the summary of existing resources, funding and technical assistance, then the gaps in data, key findings, capital and financing. A more in-depth report was done on the capital and financing tools available. So it goes through some definitions and examples of loans and debt capital, microloans, equity, tax credits, and targeted tools that are available, and then grants across federal, state, and private entities. And then there is the appendix with all of the categorical descriptions. And again, just want to reiterate that this is really should be understood as a scan, not an exhaustive collection. There were some areas that were not examined necessarily, like philanthropic options. And this is a text-heavy slide, so I will walk through it a little more closely, and then also feel free to, as I mentioned, add any questions in the chat. But this is the summary of the key findings that were taken from the existing resources report. These are categorized across general, potential gaps, and potential barriers as the categories. And general, I think, is probably fairly self-explanatory. There do appear to be many available funding opportunities for Maine's farm, food, forest products, forestry, and fishery sectors between public and private entities, including loans, equity, grants, and tax credits. Within those, which we will go into more detail about what the breakout looks like and the numbers, where they're available from, what the distribution looks like, it does appear that agriculture and food businesses may have more funding opportunities than forest products and fisheries. But we have not necessarily assessed that in comparison to demonstrated need. Need is something that we'll be accounting for through the TA surveys, the surveys for TA providers and farm and food businesses, as well as interviews. And we're also looking at collecting a total number of log businesses to just do a comparison in that sense. And then also there is technical assistance available in many forms. And I'll note also that we did not necessarily account for all of the fee-for-service technical assistance options. So when we get to that point, that will be reflecting what is available through states, NGOs, et cetera. So potential gaps, as indicated, there may be fewer funding opportunities for pre-venture and startups rather than businesses further along in the stage of development. This is something that we are diving into with the survey. We want to understand what the growth stage is and really be able to section that out. As was mentioned in the previous presentation, the needs can be very similar across these growth stages, or they could be very different. And we just want to understand what funding opportunities there are for each of these, and make sure that this is ground truth, that there are more funding opportunities currently for those phases. There are also more grants available for production rather than value-added production, processing, manufacturing, distribution, retail. And there's more equity available for manufacturing and retail businesses rather than production or farming. That is often the case, but just going to highlight that that is a potential gap. Business financial planning and access to capital are the most common types of TA. Less common is land access services, transfers, or business succession planning and production operations assistance, as well as in-depth one-to-one TA. And in-depth one-to-one TA versus these other options is really the longer term, 6 months to 1 year programs that allow the the recipient to get very hands-on support, I would say. Typically what we're seeing is more of a, there's an immediate need that they might be able to receive TA assistance for, but if it were something like cleaning up their books or doing a business plan long-term or something like that, there is a gap there. So that is the ample short-term technical assistance, but longer term is less common. And then initial barriers gleaned from this existing resources report are that there are many loans available.
I think this meeting goes on for 8 more minutes and I don't have my AirPod.
There are many loans available across the value chain, but there are likely some types of businesses having difficulty accessing those loans. That is an area of further research that we will be delving into with the interviews and the survey results. There may be certain types of businesses that are completely unable to access funding. More research will be done there. And then more research is also needed on gaps in technical assistance and whether there is options to increase one-to-one and wraparound services and how those would help address these aforementioned gaps and barriers. Okay, and here are some breakouts of some of the numbers. So the funding resources, overall, there are 105 total funding entities that were identified, and that is across federal, state, and private or regional funds. And within those, there are 145 funding programs that we identified. Again, this was as a scan. There may be some more out there, but this is the general breakdown. As you can see, the majority are through loan programs and then, or sorry, the majority are grant programs, then loan programs with 55 there. And then it's a significant step down into the equity programs, tax credit, and there are 2 targeted impact investment programs and 2 cost share programs for forestry specifically. And this is the breakout by type of provider and available loans to the types of business. This goes back to just that point that we had mentioned that it does seem like there is more for agricultural businesses and farms and food businesses. One thing that I do want to note is that so this information is available in the existing resources report. There's a spreadsheet that is linked there, so you can actually see the details of what funds we're referring to. This data reflects when this research was done, which was completed by early February, prior to some of the decisions that have been made by the current administration. And so it is worth just pointing out that while we already know that some of these funds that are listed in the spreadsheet have been cut going forward, like the local foods purchasing agreement program, we also know that the future of a number of these funds may be uncertain, and we just will have to wait and see on those. There are also some opportunities reflected in these numbers that were one-time funds or that were dependent on COVID-related resources and will not be available going forward. So this is really to be understood as a snapshot of what was available by the end of December 2024, January 2025. And this is the breakout of technical assistance types. And so you can see by sector, by organizational type, and by type of service. Again, there is a predominance of what is available to agricultural and food businesses. Forestry is also represented well by sector. And then the majority of it is coming from nonprofit organizations, as I mentioned. We did not necessarily account for all fee-for-service providers that would be available. And in doing the initial review of the previous stakeholder assessment, we did note that some mentioned that they relied almost exclusively on private fee-for-service TA. So that is something that we will keep in mind and definitely continue to delve into as we do this new round of stakeholder assessment. And the types of service, as had been mentioned, the predominance there is for business and financial, and significantly less when it comes to issues of land access, land transfers, succession planning, et cetera. And then we did want to save some time for some questions, but I don't believe that Erica is on unless someone in the background is able to see that she has joined. It might be a bit early for her still.
Yeah, and I'm also here to respond to questions, particularly on the financing tools side, and some things related to the different capital categories and make sense making around the gaps. So we don't have to have radio silence as needed, but Erica is planning to arrive in 5 to 10 minutes from what she said recently.
Yes, and we also did want to save some time actually because a part of our goal with the stakeholder engagement aspect is to use these meetings with the advisory board to gain some feedback and just strategically and efficiently use your time. So while we do want to open the floor to any questions that you have based off of what's been presented thus far, what you've seen when reviewing the report, or as Eric mentioned, if there's any specific questions around financial tools or the categories, please feel free to let us know, but also we'd love to take some time, if we have it, to pose the questions back to you around existing resources and financial tools from your perspectives and standpoints, what you might have noticed or would like to point out or flag as gaps or barriers, either that were already reflected here or that you just want to, emphasize a little bit further or add some nuance to. If there are any questions that you have about technical assistance and what you believe might be biggest barriers or gaps there. And yes, if there's any of the financial tools you'd like to learn more about. So happy to open the floor up to some of that feedback, as well as start to collect any questions that Eric or myself might be able to answer.
Aisha, I had just one quick question about like assessing barriers, and I was wondering if you identified a barrier around like just thinking about accessing existing resources and like even like we've heard from farmers who just have trouble like making the time to apply for different grants and loans and like that sort of need. Is that something that you've identified?
Absolutely. So that is something we're definitely digging into more with the survey and the interviews as well, but from the interim stakeholder assessment analysis, so those interviews that were conducted in 2022, early 2022, across sector types, that was a need that was brought up, was not only a lack of understanding on how to access, but also there were some that mentioned fears around accessing, if they worried that it might disrupt other benefits that they receive. That was brought up by some of the tribal producers. Fears about accessing if they were new Mainers or new Americans, what might be available to them. So across sector types and backgrounds, that was absolutely a barrier that was brought up repeatedly.
Can't see everyone, but I see that Amy has a question.
Yeah, I guess I want to, I think what I took away from that was that there was gaps in sort of like equity, like capital, and among the value added businesses especially. And I guess I just wanted to say that really tracks with some of the initial research that was done, and as far as sort of like the lack of low cost capital, affordable capital, patient capital. And so it was very helpful to see the sort of all of the different types of financing and different terms that were laid out in the report. So I appreciate that, but I just wanted to sort of say what resonated with me from that overview was that this really tracks with what some of the initial goal of the fund was.
Definitely, and I can just tack on to that again, that interim stakeholder assessment review that we did showed that as well, that is a consistent theme that was being requested, was patient flexible capital as a primary need. Bridge grants also was something that came up a lot. So we definitely have also noticed that alignment with some of the previous research and just that it is a continued need at this point, 3 years later. And I apologize if there was anything in the chat that I am missing. It's always difficult to get back to that when you're screen sharing. So if there's anything from there that should be highlighted, feel free to bring it to my attention.
I'm not seeing anything. Does anyone else have other questions? Scanning to look for hands, but not seeing.
Note that there are questions in the Q&A column.
I might have a question. Are these fundings for businesses or for nonprofits or for both?
The fund would be directed towards businesses.
Okay.
Or agricultural businesses, food businesses, farms, forestry.
Okay.
Although I'll just chime in, I mean, if we're talking about the AFPIF fund, I think the statute's silent on how that farm business is organized. So it could be for profit, it could be a nonprofit, it could be a cooperative. I don't think the statute speaks to that.
Okay.
Correct. Thank you, Craig, for clarifying that.
Not seeing any other questions at the moment. Aisha, did you want to take a few minutes to pose some questions to the group, or we have about 13 minutes left of your time, so it'd be good to make use of that if we can.
Yeah, and I'm also happy to comment on about the accessing grant funds and strategies for that, and some of the comments about capital gaps, etc. So, but go ahead, Aisha, if you want to pose some questions, but we don't have to worry about being able to helpfully and usefully fill the time.
Yeah, I mean,
I'm
go
sorry.
ahead.
I'm new to using Zoom on my phone and I can't figure out how to raise my hand. I'm working on that. But I was curious, like, with the funders that you've talked to, is there a sense of maybe what's unquantifiable about like the types of innovations or ideas that have come to the table but have not been funded because of sort of the barriers, some of the barriers that you mentioned? Like, I just wonder, like, what kind, like, if our fund were easier to access, what kinds of ideas or innovations or entities or individuals would be more likely to apply for it if that were the case? And is there any data around that from like the funders' experience in actually turning away applications? I don't know if there's any theme there that might be helpful to us to understand.
Absolutely. That is a fantastic question. So as I mentioned, we have just completed the analysis of the interim stakeholder assessment, which was a series of interviews with sector-specific experts, policymakers, TA providers, and then businesses themselves. And one of the questions, the interviews had been conducted in a semi-structured to exploratory manner. One of the questions that was posed to providers was, what is the primary reason that you turn away applications and applicants? And it was not fully replied to, so we don't have consistent enough findings yet, but we have flagged that as a question that we do want to go back into and get a lot more feedback on. So that will be something that we're targeting for interviews themselves, is talking to funders and seeing exactly that of where is there, innovative, as you mentioned, ideas being brought forth that just don't fit into current funding structures. So we will be digging into that. Thank you.
Claire?
Thanks. I hope I'm allowed to add to that as a non-advisory board member. I just wanted to say that, when we think about barriers, we already know a lot, and we can always know more, but we already know a lot about some of the commonly articulated barriers for different types of natural resource businesses, including forestry, and in some cases also marine. And we can back into some of those limitations around existing resources from a perspective of, the types of organizations that sometimes struggle to access public resources or investment funding. For example, a lot of natural resource businesses in the state are sole proprietorships. That can be challenging when it comes to accessing capital. We see this a lot in forestry in particular. So I think understanding the nuance, not just in agriculture, but also in some of these other natural resource economies, starts with understanding the types of entities that are looking for funding. And just another quick thought on a similar note is often a barrier is what we're allowed to use the funding for. So the allowable uses. A lot of times with federal funding, some of the things people in Maine anecdotally really want to pay for, like buying land, right? Or making improvements to leaseholds or rentals or something like that. A lot of those things are prohibited when you use federal funds. So I think maybe one of the gray areas this group might consider exploring is who falls through the cracks from an organizational perspective, what types of businesses, and what areas of funding might this initiative be able to pick up that often aren't touchable from other sources of capital. So for what it's worth.
Thank you, Claire. Absolutely. Eric, did you have something to add there?
Well, I can pick up where Claire left off. I think, if you're designing a program like this and thinking about how to work together as a team, this question of the best and highest use of your funds or public funds or state funds is a great question to ask, because it does highlight that gap piece. And we have seen, and thinking, and just a little bit of foreshadowing for the benchmarking stuff. I've worked for a long time with Vermont's analogous program, and I've been speaking with folks in Massachusetts and Michigan for next month. But sometimes you don't know what is missing until you get out there and see where people are hitting the wall. And so sometimes in reimbursement-based grants, other folks come in and do bridge loans to enable folks that are financially excluded because they can't pay the money up front to get the reimbursement, and that can help the access to flow. So sometimes it's an ecosystem solution, and sometimes it's a best and highest use of public funds. And I think as we're looking at an environment where there's a bigger question mark around the federal funds, then not just around eligibility, but also around need, and who is going to address whether it's access-based programs or some of the things that are disappearing at the moment. Those are great questions to ask. And another thing to think about is the public dollars can unlock the private dollars in the other capital. So understanding the barriers of the other capital providers from the perspective of something that public funds could do that could shift their decision making. And that really all comes down to my last point on this, which is risk. That understanding the risk of all the stakeholders, whether it's the people putting money in or the people trying to do the work, is a great way to analyze and make sense of what the best place for you folks to help is. And the last thing that I'll say around applicants and access is that oftentimes when these funds start, there can be a proliferation of initial applications with a potentially low level of qualification on an application by application basis. And what we found in Vermont over the years was that the robustness of the business planning technical assistance can create a flywheel effect over years, where somebody comes in year one, not prepared, is directed to technical assistance, come back in year two, year three with a stronger and stronger application. And so there's a synergy between the technical assistance funding and the business funding that can help not just who gets access the first time around, but who can gain access over time. And then a key question is, do you want to make resources available to support people's applications, or what are your boundaries in that regard? Hey, I can't write your application for you, because you often will find more resourced organizations hiring somebody to write their grant, and it looks wonderful, but it's, that becomes an access barrier. So I'll stop there.
There is one question in the chat. It says, related to allowable use of funds, does AFF-PIF allow funds to be used for meat infrastructure processing? And did that come up in this assessment?
I mean, I don't think we've defined exactly what will be allowed yet, Craig, if there's anything in the statute that that would deter that, but I think that is something that will be developed as part of the recommendations.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I think that's one of the jobs for this group, is to make that kind of decision. But the whether it came up in the studies, I don't know.
Tricia, can I ask a question?
Yeah, go ahead.
For either Aisha or Eric. So I represent timber harvesting contractors. So a question that comes to mind, and I don't know how in depth you got into the benchmarking, but it's of interest to me. So Claire mentioned sole proprietors. So there are sole proprietors in this industry, but I would say that has changed immensely in the last 5 years, since the pandemic, since inflation occurred, since we lost markets. The sole proprietors have really dropped out in droves of the market. But I guess my question is more on the forestry side. If you got into grants versus loans, and the reason I ask that, I think contractors are very wary of grants because they have a tendency to prop up businesses that may not have the capacity to continue. So they'll take advantage of a grant, but to buy a piece of equipment, but that may not keep them in business. So they're more prone to see if there's a revolving loan program that may have a low interest rate. And so benchmarking what is actually out there and then comparing ag to forestry in that perspective would be really beneficial. So I don't know how deep you got it into your benchmarking, but I know from the timber harvesting side, that would be really important information to have. Because I think, there's a perception that there isn't a lot available for low interest capital for the timber harvesting community, but there may be an immense amount on the ag side.
Aisha, anything I can comment briefly on that?
Yeah, I mean, I would just say I think that that's something that we already did start to notice in the existing resources report, as mentioned in the early key findings slide, that there is definitely more funding opportunity available for agriculture and farm food businesses. And specifically regarding the types of capital, I think might be indicated in the spreadsheet. I can confirm with Erica and make sure if that is clearly indicated. But also from, again, that review of the earlier interviews that were conducted, that is something that we did notice already come out, is that the sector needs for forestry are very different. And even among the types of entities within forestry, it ranged between size and sole proprietorship, et cetera. You mentioned that it has shifted significantly since the pandemic. And that was something that was brought up, was the sector has been hit very hard by the changes in the industry since then. So that is something that we are looking at for the interview phase, is looking into those threads around what forestry needs will be.
I see Murata has a hand up, so I'll answer very briefly on this. So as a grant-making group, the advisory board has an opportunity in the design of the applications to assess for whether the funds are going to be able to be utilized in an ongoing sustainable process, or the one-time funds are actually going to create a liability. And so that's something that can be built into the review and assessment of the applications. To the degree to which revolving loan funds is going to be a complementary resource that's provided outside of the fund, then you can think about how to be positioning in relation to that and incentivizing that. And one of the things that comes up with these programs is how you define what they would call your but-for clause. And so, are you going to be giving money to folks or really can't get this money elsewhere, or you're going to do that in a softer way and look at a range of reasons why you would or would not give funding to folks. And so that dance between the ecosystem and the fund will be an ongoing consideration. And that's one of the areas. Is this somebody who's best served by a revolving loan fund, or is there a reason why a grant is appropriate for this business and they have a way for the business to continue to sustain itself after the grant funds are expended?
Murata?
Yeah, I wondered if part of this research or in other funding mechanisms, have we in the state of Maine, I know corridor is a dirty word in Maine, but have we looked at infrastructure corridors between production, processing, storage, and distribution, particularly where we did see such a geographic spread of applications? I just wonder, is is like the practicalities of geographic movement of product, is that something that we're looking at? Has Michigan looked at it? Vermont is pretty north-south oriented, and strongly so, but I'm just curious, like, is there work around that we should look at? Because certainly you can have a processor in one part of the state, but if you can't get your product to the other part of the state, or the producer is 5 hours away from the processor, it doesn't necessarily work. And I just wonder if there's already been thought put into this and where that thought is homed.
Aisha, anything on that?
Well, that isn't necessarily something that we've looked into. Claire or anyone else, I don't know if that is something that you'd actually want to address.
I can address kind of initially. It's definitely something that I've heard come up in a lot of different funder, lender, and investor groups. And even most recently, I think Maine Food Convergence had a processing work group call where there was a lot of discussion about need for transportation and logistics investments specifically. I've heard some sort of similar conversations around, where in the state should you set up, if you were to set up a large cold storage facility, where should that be? And there are other agencies and groups that are talking a bit about connectivity, even with maritime shipping and logistics. You know, how do you get things to Ameskip in Portland? So I think there are a few different groups that are thinking about it. It is by no means a solved problem, I think. And for a state like Maine, if you're going to invest in infrastructure, I think it's really important to consider connectivity across that asset base.
And anyone aware of funders looking at this in terms of their funding strategies? I know we've done some work of like focusing on a rustic producer, like historically like rim counties or like not necessarily marginalized in the context of geo, but with the idea of like infrastructure work, it just seems kind of critical in a way to think.
The one thing I'll say about it is that when you think about your geographic distribution strategy of like where the grants are going to go, where the funds are going to go across different parts of the state, to not to be circumspect about being just across the board and trying to check every box versus thinking about these strategic considerations. And one of the things we saw in other states with the RFSI implementation is that there would be sort of a rigorous effort to distribute funds and a lack of direct communication with the processing community stakeholders on the ground around strategic opinions about optimization of location. And so there's also a stakeholder engagement opportunity with folks in Maine to try to get insight on how to optimize location and density of processing infrastructure.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that in terms of the interviews that we're going to be conducting, we are going to be looking at receiving insight and feedback from the advisory board and the DACF team and CEI around who might be the folks that should be considered for those select targeted interviews. So Claire, you mentioned some groups that that are already working on it. We can definitely target them to address that particular question, make sure that we're having some feedback on it.
Great. Thank you for that. I just looking at the time, I know we wanted to make sure that we left a few minutes for public input. I don't know if you're seeing Craig or Jody, anyone wanting to provide input?
Tom, are you able to see that on your end if any public members are raising their hands?
No panelists or no attendees have raised their hands.
Give it a moment, and then if not, we can move on.
There are only 4 attendees.
Okay. Then I think we're safe. Shall I jump in about the next agenda item regarding meeting format?
Yeah, great. That'd be great.
All right. Well, let me just direct all of you to page 10 in your packet. And that was the page in which at your request at the last meeting, we developed a little bit clearer board meeting schedule and the draft content for the upcoming meetings. And then some consideration given to whether which meetings could be potentially held in person, which you had expressed an interest in. So what I've proposed here is an in-person session, the first one being in June in Augusta, and consideration there in terms of location being that the legislature may still be in session at that time. And so there may be many folks, including one of the co-chairs here, who may need to be close to the Capitol. So I've proposed that. You'll note that I proposed a longer time for that meeting to take advantage of you being together. And I'll jump for a moment, I'll skip over August for a second and jump to September, where theoretically that could be the meeting in which the previous meeting work groups had given some presentations as to some suggestions that they had, recommendations, and that there was final decision making at the September meeting. There are a couple of things in play here, and I'll throw them out in no particular order. One is that this may be a fairly ambitious timeline, and we just in trying to figure out what we could fit in a 1.5 hour period today, we realized there was no way that we could probably give justice to the RFSI, listening sessions to a forestry proposed presentation, even if we had that in our hands, and a presentation from an in-common group. So I'll be candid, I do have some concerns about that the standard time length for these meetings is just 1.5 hours. I think it's really difficult to cover a lot of ground in that time. So one suggestion I might make for your consideration is to change all meetings to a minimum of 2 hours. Were it my druthers, I would probably suggest 2.5, but I realize that's that's a big ask of all of you. So I would suggest at a minimum, the standard meeting time, be it for Zoom meetings, be 2 hours. It would enable us to pack more in terms of presentation and content. Then becomes the question of, if you agree with that, given the additional time, how much content can we provide to you? And how much time do you need in separate work groups to really dig into a particular area, a focus area? So just to hold a little bit more in your head, for example, at the next meeting in April, if we are able to pull together a forestry presentation by April, it would be logical to do that, to provide a parallel presentation as we did for ag today. We have the benchmark report that will be ready to be presented by In-Common Group, and a piece of that benchmark report is a likely presentation from Vermont itself, just firsthand, to talk about their experience, because Vermont is one of the states that's being benchmarked. So that's a lot to cover. Even with all of that, at that point, it is the logical point for you to decide how to break up into work groups. Like, what are the topics of those work groups that are the logical divisions? Is it agriculture, food system, and forest products? Is it something other than that? So we'll need some time on the agenda for that as well. That will then determine ultimately how many meetings you're going to want, or how many months you're going to want to just be meeting in work group and not as a full group. So I realize I'm throwing a lot at you, but I have a few suggestions. One is, if it were okay with you, for us to give further consideration to extending the timeline, that we may not necessarily have the presentation of draft rules in November. Number 2 would be to have the baseline time for each meeting be 2 hours. Number 3, to decide whether at a minimum the June meeting would be in person, and that would be in Augusta. I think if we made those 3 decisions, it would allow us to kind of move forward and make some further decisions at the next meeting.
Okay, does anyone have any initial thoughts or comments on those 3 decisions we should think about in the next few minutes? So the timeline, Jody, do you have a sense of how much further we might want to extend it then, or?
We haven't discussed it internally.
Okay.
I think that when you look at page 10, the idea of in August having the working groups make a presentation, and then the very next meeting approving a final plan for instruments and priorities,
Seems ambitious.
feels a little ambitious to me. So a couple months, I'm pulling this out of the air.
Yeah, okay. So do we want to start maybe with thinking about extending the regular meetings to 2 hours, and whether folks are feeling like that could work for them? I don't know the best way to, if people want to just give it, oh, I love the thumbs up, Shannon, thank you.
Maybe if anybody could raise major concerns so that we have an opportunity to consider those.
Amy?
I just wanted to offer, so it doesn't feel like I'm being rude. Like I don't have an alternative for school pickup on Wednesdays, so I would need to leave by 2:45 if I'm not in Augusta, and if I'm at home, and then if I'm in Augusta, I would have to be like, you know, driving for some of that. So I don't want people to work around me. I just want it to be known. But I'm support 2 hours, and yeah.
Yeah, there's also maybe the option of starting at 12:30, like extending the start time earlier, if that would be more helpful for people.
Major concerns about extending to 2 hours and starting at 12:30.
Matt, did you have a comment?
Yeah, I thankfully you folks are thinking about all of this. I think it's really hard to have any informed opinion about this, not knowing the extent of the work. And, you know, is that a 5,000 person hour that will be distributed amongst the committee, or is it less, or is it 10 times more? And it also appears from the schedule that the working groups will be working during these meetings as opposed to outside of these meetings. And my assumption with being on many nonprofit boards is that committees work on a different schedule. And that was my assumption going into this, that if I was on a working group, we would meet outside of this meeting and work in parallel. So I don't know what your intentions are. I don't know what the committee members think of that. But
yeah, you know, this is definitely iterative. When we came up with we wanted to make sure that we had a consistent meeting scheduled right up front, and that's how we landed on the third whatever of every month. You raise a really important question, Matt, about when we move into working groups. Probably what's going to make sense is that the individuals who are within that working group come up with their own schedule. And our thought initially, our thought currently is that we would not convene as a full group during that month. We would only have working groups convene. So I think you're right. The May, you know, unless you know, chairs feel differently, or the rest of you, the May 28th and the July 30th working group months, if you will, needn't necessarily fall on those dates if the members of that work group would find a better time to meet.
Yeah, I think that makes sense.
Or meet multiple times.
Yeah. Yeah. Any other concerns then about switching the meeting time from 12:30 to 2:30 for the other standing meetings? And how are folks feeling then about the June in-person meeting in Augusta? Any concerns about that?
Again, just to be transparent, I'm gonna be out of the state. So I don't know if there's a I wanted to be in person. I was one of the people that like advocated for that. So I am so sorry to say it, but I'll be out of the state that week. So I don't know if if it would be practical or productive to have a Zoom option, but I did just want to be transparent about that. And I also have a conflict that in August. So
well, for all of the meetings we do, we're required to have a Zoom option. So that will be part of it for sure. So Jody, I don't know, maybe we should maybe it sounds like we can move forward with that 12:30 to 2:30 schedule for the standing meetings, and with the June in-person meeting, and maybe we need to reconnect about some of the like extending the schedule and think about what that will look like at a later date.
Sure. Sounds great. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you so much, Claire and Aisha and Eric, for your presentations. That was super helpful. And yeah, we've got a lot to think about and to weed through. So thank you so much again. And anything else? Any other last comments before we close out, or any other questions? Okay.
Thank
All
you,
right.
folks. Really appreciate your work. It's so valuable and important.
Thanks.
Please feel free to reach out at any point with questions for us if they come up.
Thanks, everyone.
Yeah.
Thank
Thanks.
you.
See you all
Nice to see
later.
everyone.
Thanks, folks.